ध्यायेत् शारदचन्द्रसुन्दरमुखम् ताम्रारविन्दे क्षणम् भक्ताभीष्टवराभयप्रदकरम् कौपीनमात्रोज्ज्वलम् स्वात्मानन्दरसानुभूतिविवशम् सर्वानवद्याङ्गकम् श्रीमन्तं रमणेश्वरं गुरुवरं योगासनाध्यासितं ध्यायेत् रमणेश्वरम् ध्यायेत् रमणेश्वरम् ध्यायेत् रमणेश्वरम् हृदयकुहरमध्ये केवलं ब्रह्ममात्रम् ह्यहमहमिति साक्षात् आत्मरूपेण भाति हृदि विषमनसा स्वं चिन्वतामज्जता वा पवनचलनरोधात् आत्मनिष्ठो भवत्वम्. Prostrations to Ramana, who shines as the self in all beings. Since Dileep sir is not available, I thought we will share a few question and answers from the book Ramana Answers Self-Enquiry 1900 to 1950. This has been compiled by Sri A.R. Natarajan, by our founder president. He has put together the question and answers which are related to self-enquiry. This is in the form of question and answer. After this, after the sharing, we will have a 20-minute meditation session, after which Dr. Sarada will be talking about Ramana Gita. She will be sharing about, meditating about the question and answers which have been compiled by Ganapati Muni and the answers by Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharshi. There are many questioners who have questioned about different aspects of spiritual questions. So we will have that and we'll conclude with a prayer. By Bhagavan's grace, we will take up question number 16, 17, 18 and 19. The devotee questions, how long should enquiry be practiced? How long should enquiry be practiced? Maharshi says, as long as there are impressions of objects in the mind, the enquiry, who am I, is required. As long as there are impressions of objects in the mind, the enquiry, who am I, is required. As thoughts arise, they should be destroyed, and then and there, in the very place of their origin, through enquiry. As thoughts arise, they should be destroyed then and there, in the very place of their origin, through enquiry. If one resorted to contemplation of the self without a break, until the self is gained, that alone would do. If one resorted to contemplation of the self without a break, until the self is gained, that alone would do. As long as there are enemies within the fortress, they will continue to sally forth. If they are destroyed then as they are emerged, the fortress will fall into our hands. As long as there are enemies within the fortress, they will continue to sally forth. If they are destroyed as they emerge, the fortress will fall into our hands. This always Nandakumarji keeps saying, whenever the thought arises, Bhagavan also insists on not going behind any thought. He insists in cutting off the thought at the root itself. Wherever it arises, whenever it arises, cut at that. Cut the root itself instead of plucking out one by one. Bhagavan says, when there is a tree, instead of plucking out one leaf after another, if you pluck out the root, then what remains? There is no tree at all. So we should not allow the tree of this huge tree of this thought to grow. As and when it sprouts from the seed, then itself we should cut off. And then there arises the self. There we merge into the self. We move on to the next question. I have studied and understood the essence of the Shastras. I have repeated the great mantras with contemplation. Many austerities have I performed. Missing still is the Lord's grace. Were there lapses in my tapas? Have I missed its very nature? Though learned, I am ignorant. I surrender to you. All-knowing one, accept me as your disciple and bless me. Once again the question. I have studied and understood the essence of Shastras. I have repeated the great mantras with contemplation. Many austerities have I performed. Missing still is the Lord's grace. Were there lapses in my tapas? Have I missed its very nature? Though learned, I am ignorant. I surrender to you, all-knowing one. Accept me as your disciple and bless me. Maharshi answers to this question. This is the famous question of Ganapati Muni, where he realizes that he has not attained the ultimate state. Although he has performed many crores and crores and crores of japa, he has understood all the Vedas and Shastras. He knows everything. He has everything in his fingertip. And he had been graced with the title Kavya Kantha. The Shastras, Vedas and Puranas and poetry was dancing in his tongue. But still he realized that this is not the ultimate state. So he was in agony. He had that yearning to attain the self. But then he realized that he needs a guru who should help him to move forward. So Bhagavan comes in his thoughts and he says, there I am sitting in the Virupaksha cave. Muni, who was in Tiruvannamalai at that point of time, he runs to see the Maharshi. He runs We know the heat of Tiruvannamalai. Without even caring about any of the situation, he runs to Maharshi and asks this question. Then Maharshi replies, when the mind enquires from where the notion I arises and dissolves right there at the origin of its birth, that is tapas. On the enquiry as to the exact origin from where the sound of mantra arises, the mind dissolves at that origin itself, and that is tapas. When the mind enquires from where the I notion arises and dissolves right there at the origin of its birth, that is tapas. On the enquiry as to the exact origin from where the sound of mantra arises, the mind dissolves at the origin itself. That is tapas. Maharshi gives his first spoken Upadesha to Ganapati Muni after a long time after he has reached Tiruvannamalai on Arunachala. This is the first spoken Upadesha given to Ganapati Muni. So, this is called the whence am I, from where the I thought arises, merge at its source, from wherever the nada or the sound of the mantra arises. When we have our mouth closed and there is no sound externally, we don't have any sound, and when we chant the mantra, when we chant it and when we go within, that is when we can find the source of the mantra. We can see when we are chanting, if we are chanting Om Mahase Namaha, Om Shenajataya Namaha, Om Shri Ramanaya Namaha, Om Gurave Namaha. So whenever that Gurave comes or that the thought arises, the sound arises, it goes back to its source, and there is a gap between those two. That is where Bhagavan asks us to get back to the source. That is where the origin is. So that Upadesha Ganapati Muni has got, and it helps people who do japa, people who look at the thought and get back to the source. When Samai sadhana is done by many people, and this Upadesha helps all of them. We move to the next question. The devotee asks, what is the difference between enquiry and meditation? What is the difference between enquiry and meditation? Enquiry consists in retaining the mind in the self. Meditation consists in thinking that one's self is Brahman, existence, consciousness, bliss. Enquiry consists in retaining the mind in the self. Meditation consists in thinking that one's self is Brahman, existence, consciousness, bliss. Self-enquiry, when we inquire into the self, what happens? The process is that whenever a thought is arising, we immediately question, for whom is this thought? We get an answer, it is for me. Immediately question, who am I? And wait for the answer to reveal from within. Never answer the question, who am I? And wait. Again, if a thought arises, question, for whom is this thought? We get an answer, it is for me. Question, who am I? Wait for the answer to reveal from within. By the grace of Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, for the next 20 minutes, We will hold on to the self and practice the method of self inquiry given to us by the Master. Namo Ramana. Over to Shardaka.
Namo Ramana. Prostrations to the self. Prostrations to Ramana. Shining is the self in all beings. By the immense grace of the self manifested as Ramana, we in this part of the satsang meditate on the verses of Ramana Gita, throwing light upon self inquiry and other aspects of one's practice of self inquiry, the doubts that may arise during the practice of self inquiry. These are all addressed by Bhagavan, answers from Bhagavan to questions by different seekers of truth. And these questions and answers have been compiled by Ganapati Muni as Ramana Gita in 18 chapters. Just like the Bhagavad Gita, there are 18 chapters in Ramana Gita. We are now meditating on the 14th chapter, which is Jivan Mukti Vichara. Jivan Mukti Vichara. So, in this chapter, Bhagavan has told us about different types of Jivan Mukti, different powers of the Jivan Mukta, and how these powers ultimately are only God given powers, whether it is a Jivan Mukta or whether it is any ignorant mortal. The manifestation, all aspects of manifestation stem only from God's grace. So, this clearly defines for us in our sadhana that internally one must abide in the self. In Uladu Narpadu Anubandham, Bhagavan says that Advaita should not be applied into areas. One is with the Guru, and the other is in daily life, in daily interactions, in the interactions with the world, because there are differences. So, Bhagavan is saying that all these differences, any difference that one may see, whether it is a difference in a so-called ignorant person one and another, or between the ignorant person and the Jivan Mukta, or between one Jivan Mukta and another, it is all only in the realm of the apparent. So Bhagavan says that some people also say that the wise ones go, the liberated ones go to different worlds like Kailasa and Vaikuntha, or the region of the sun. These are the last two verses of the chapter where he says, कैलासं केऽपि मुक्तानां लोकमाहुर्मनीषिणः एके वदन्ति वैकुण्ठं परे त्वादित्यमण्डलम्. So he says they may go to different worlds. The world of Shiva, the world of Vishnu, the world of the sun, which is the orb of light. No matter where they have gone, says Bhagavan, Muktalokaschate te sarve vidvan bhumyadilokavat चित्रवैभवया शक्त्या स्वरूपे परिकल्पिता. So he says, like the earth and other planets, these worlds of the liberated are also projections on the self caused by its own marvelous power. Chitra, it is a projection. Vaibhavaya Shaktya, by the grand or amazing power of the self, of which? Of Swarupe. Shaktya Swarupe. Swarupe Shaktya. parikalpita. These are all imaginations. So, no matter whether we are in the best of places and whether the liberated one is there, the same thing holds for us also. If it holds even for the liberated one, what about us? No matter where we are placed, no matter what appears to be the world, it is only a projection of the self, says Bhagavan. So, in this chapter, we understand one, steady self abidance is liberation, nothing else can be called liberation. And so, what is it that we have to practice self inquiry for? It is only for steady self abidance. It is in order to get liberated, we say. What is that liberation? Steady abidance in the self, undisturbed by scriptural or worldly ideas, Bhagavan has said. So, even a scriptural idea should not disturb us, not even the best of ideas, not the best of projections. Nothing matters. In the self alone is. Everything else may happen or may not happen according to the will of the divine. This is the essence of the chapter on Jivan Mukti. It is the essence of the significance of this chapter in our practice. When Bhagavan has said that abidance in the self devoid of worldly ideas, that is very simple for us to understand. Jivan Mukti means we must not have any attachment or any movement towards any worldly notion. Movement towards, the word vritti in Sanskrit means movement, moving towards something, moving towards the worldly ideas. Supposing we do not have any attachment to worldly ideas, what happens at that point of time? Is it possible that we could have some scriptural attachments? See, scriptural attachments we may look upon in two different ways. Scripture is, of course, the Vedic texts or the words of Bhagavan or the great ones, and these are all scriptures for us, the great dictums. Also, the, the scriptural dictum, for example, says, you be truthful, truth is the best. Then how do we define truth? This question will arise in us. In different contexts, we may say that this is okay, this is not an untruth, this is an untruth in this context. But when you have to save somebody's life, telling an untruth, so called factual untruth, is acceptable. Like this, there are many subtleties in dharma. So, if we get attached to one aspect of dharma also, what will happen? We would still be in the realm of identity. Supposing the best identity we have of, see, being truthful is such a beautiful identity. But I have known people who have got hit by this identity in different ways. The identity of I will always be truthful, I have always been truthful. So, either when they are questioned, when their truth is questioned, then what happens? They completely, though they have been truthful, somehow the world blames them. In some situation it happens that the world blames them, though they are blemishless, they are blamed. Then what happens is they get completely broken, because when I have been so truthful, why is it that this blemish has come to me? This question hits them. It makes them completely lost. Or else sometimes they are not blamed, they are busy blaming others. They are busy judging others. They are busy finding fault with people. Nandakumarji often refers to his earlier experience, earlier to coming to self inquiry, when he was able to abide in the thought free state. So he said, though I was able to abide in the thought free state, because all the vasanas, because the I thought had not completely merged in its source, free from all attachments, I used to judge those who were not in the thought free state. I used to feel, oh, I am in the thought free state. Why are you not in the thought free state? I used to ask people such questions. So, the ego, the subtle ego of being free from anger, of being free from attachment, of being free from thoughts itself, that subtle ego can arise. And that is attachment in a way to scripture. That is attachment to the scriptural states which are being described. So, Bhagavan has said that Jivan Mukti is absolute freedom from all attachment. Nirvasanena maunena sthirayam sahaja sthitau. Bhagavan told us in the very first chapter, by a mauna, a silence in which there is no vasana, no trace of any vasana whatsoever. And such a one who is abiding in the self steadily, such a one may experience different powers by God's grace. But how does it matter? Such a one may go to any world. In fact, even earlier in the earlier verse also he says, if the such a one experiences invisibility by God's grace, he or she may roam around anywhere freely in all the worlds. That person may experience all this, and maybe in Shivaloka, maybe in Vaikuntha. In fact, in Adishankara's Anatma Shri Nigarhanam, that composition, he says, Shambhor Loke Shasito va Tatah Kim. If one is not abiding in the self, and one happens to be the Lord of Shivaloka, not just abiding in Shivaloka, not just a resident of Shivaloka, but the Lord of Shivaloka, which is Shiva himself, then of what use is it if one is not abiding in the self? And Bhagavan says, when asked once about the great ones like Sri Rama and Sri Krishna, he says, of course, they were Jivan Muktas. They were ever abiding in the self. They were Jivan Muktas. If you see anybody in the form of Ishvara, that Ishvara is also obviously a Jivan Mukta. On account of being Jivan Mukta, the Ishvaratva is natural. So Bhagavan is here saying that a Jivan Mukta is not bothered whether the body is there or not there, whether he is in one loka or another loka. So how does it have an import on our practice is that no matter what situation the body is placed in physically, whichever loka it is in, whichever world it is in, one must remember that it is only merely a projection of the self. And if one is in the subtle realm of the thought world, where the body is actually, in one sense, invisible, there one roams around, one may translate one's this experience into one's own experience in terms of imagination, in terms of dream, where the body is invisible, nobody else sees where we are roaming, but we may go to any of the worlds. But how does it matter? Because if one is abiding in the self, nothing else matters. And the funny part is, if one is not abiding in the self, if one is abiding in the self, nothing else matters. But what if one is not abiding in the self? Then how does anything matter in any case? Because nothing is in our hands. When one is not abiding in the self, and everything is taken care of by Ishvara and Ishvara alone, of what use is any thought of ours in any direction, it is actually meaningless. So, this way or that way, to be attached to the projections of the self, to say, oh, this is extremely beautiful because this is Shivaloka, and this is extremely ordinary because this is Bhuloka, is not the truth, says Bhagavan. This is also a projection on the self, by the self, and that is also a projection on the self, by the self. They are all like pictures in a movie. One picture may be of an ordinary small little hut, one picture may be of squalor and dirt, and another picture may be of palaces and the most beautiful landscapes and surroundings and a lot of plenty everywhere. But both are only images in the movie. How does it matter in which image, which of the other images, whether the hero is sitting in a small little hut or the hero is sitting in a palace in the projection in the movie, does it matter to that image? And why should it matter to the one who sees it also? From our perspective, when we begin to recognize that everything is a mere projection in the self, then the need to move outwards in the form of thought will slowly come to a halt. There will be no more need to hold on to any object whatsoever because it is only a mere projection on the self by the very power of the self itself, not by any other power. So, that is also something which we have to note, that everything that is happening by only by the power of the self, not by any other power. The self itself is projecting itself, the self itself is including itself, the self itself is then swallowing itself. Kabalita Ghana Vishwarupa Kirana Valya. When there is nothing apart from the self, isn't it futile to be spending time on meditating on various objects and other things, on various activities, on the right and the wrong, on where to go and where not to go? So, the best course, as Bhagavan says to Mother Aragamma, is always to remain silent, to understand that no movement is really worth anything at all, and therefore to remain still in the self. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya. अपार सच्चित् सुखवारिराशेः यस्योर्मिमात्रं भुवनं समस्तं गुहाहितं तं रमणं गभीरं चिन्ताविहीनं हृदि चिन्तयामि. नमो रमण.
Namo Ramana.